Voters will head to the polls on Tuesday, April 26th for the Pennsylvania primary. Who are the candidates and where do they stand on the issues? Tonight, live from the University Park campus of the Pennsylvania State University, WPSU and the McCourtney Institute for Democracy present a roundtable-style debate among the Democratic candidates for the U.S. Senate. Each is vying for a chance to unseat Republican Senator Pat Toomey in November. Now, to introduce the candidates, here's tonight's moderator, Patty Satalia.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us. In a little more than 2 weeks, voters will decide which one of 3 Democratic candidates will run for a seat in the U.S. Senate. Allow me to introduce them. John Fetterman is mayor of Braddock. Elected in 2005, he is now serving his 3rd term. Fetterman earned a master's degree in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and began his career as a mentor within the Big Brothers Big Sisters program, where he says he was struck by the stark realities of inequality in the U.S. He joined AmeriCorps and spent 2 years in Pittsburgh's Hill District setting up the first computer labs in the neighborhood and teaching GED courses to young parents. Katie McGinty was Governor Tom Wolf's chief of staff until July, when she resigned to launch her Senate bid. McGinty ran unsuccessfully for governor in 2014 and served as secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection under Governor Ed Rendell. Previously, she served as chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality under Bill Clinton, the first woman in that role. She also served as an advisor to Al Gore's 2000 presidential campaign. Between government positions, she served on the board of directors of several energy-related firms. Joe Sestak is a retired 3-star Navy admiral and former U.S. congressman. He's vying for another chance to face off against Republican Senator Pat Toomey. In the 2010 primary, Sestak defeated Senator Arlen Specter, who had switched to the Democratic Party, but lost the general election to Toomey by a narrow margin. During the Clinton administration, Sestak served as Director for Defense Policy on the National Security Council. He was director of the Navy's Anti-Terrorism Unit after 9/11 and the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us. Let's turn now to John Gastile, Director of Penn State's McCourtney Institute for Democracy, for background on tonight's debate. John?
Thank you, Patty. The McCourtney Institute for Democracy here at Penn State has teamed up with WPSU to bring you this event. Too often, debates devolve into posturing, catchphrases, and name-calling, instead of serious talk about serious issues. We hope tonight's program provides better information to those who need it most, the voters. Young people bear much of the brunt of our nation's problems, and young voters have already flexed their muscle in this year's elections. Therefore, we've turned over to the students the questions for tonight's debate. Their questions will ask for clear positions on key issues, but they'll also assess candidates' ability to deliberate effectively once in office, even with members of the opposing political party. Voting is not only a right, but also a civic duty, and we hope tonight's debate helps all of our viewers fulfill that important responsibility. Now back to Patty for the rules of tonight's debate.
Tonight's questions, as John said, were written and will be asked by college students from across the Commonwealth. Each candidate will have 2 minutes per question, unless otherwise indicated. If candidates would like to rebut something, we encourage a discreet hand signal. However, in the interest of getting to as many questions as possible in 1 hour, rebuttal and follow-up questions will be at the discretion of the moderator. For our first question, we go to Zoe Hu, a freshman secondary education major from Penn State. Zoe?
Thank you, Patty. None of us would be here without the help of a solid background education. What would you do to help public primary and secondary education, especially in low-income communities with fewer local resources?
As decided by lots before tonight's broadcast, we begin with Mr. Sestak, please.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. And Zoe, thanks for the question. It's actually great to be back here because after I did narrowly lose, I turned down those lobbying jobs and actually came to Penn State to teach a course on ethical leadership and a course on restoring the American dream. And Zoe, we actually studied this question. I have always looked at education as our homeland defense. One other thing that I actually did after I narrowly lost is I worked on a nonprofit where I actually turned my pay into charity, but I worked in Philadelphia in the lower income. And we focused primarily in West Philadelphia. Tough, but a good spot there. Because Drexel University wants to expand, but we don't want regentification to move people out. And so what we did is focused on pre-K through early childhood. Every study shows that focused on that, you can actually get $1 for input, $7 of productivity. But we also focused upon those who are just about falling off the rails. When I joined up during the Vietnam War era, they used to say the Navy or jail. Well, now, guess what? We actually focus down there on trying to get them back on track in what I call the artisans, and that's primarily our community colleges. And the reason for that, as we tried to link these youth who are getting off the track to those, is because in Pennsylvania, only 5% of our colleges are community colleges. It's a very inefficient way, less expensive to get a start, to be a MIG or TIG welder, for example. But across the nation, it's actually 25%. 62% of all our youth in college across America are in a community college. But here in Pennsylvania, because we have such a low number, only about 28%. So those were the two areas we focused in. And finally, Common Core. If instituted properly, Common Core can be an asset of a common standard. But the tests are not to be one where you get to the teacher, and that's what you measure.
And that's the indication that you're out of time. Thank you, Mr. Sestak. We go to Ms. McGinty.
Well, thank you very much. And Zoe, thanks for your question. You know, I'll start just with a little background myself. I was 9th of 10 kids. And in my family, I was the first to go to 4-year college. And I know for me, the whole ticket to the dream I was able to pursue, being a leader in the environment, working in the White House with President Clinton, it was all about education. But here's what we know. In Pennsylvania, we have some of the very, very best schools in the country. And we also, unfortunately, have the biggest gap, poverty gap, between the wealthiest school districts and the poorest school districts. Now, every child deserves a great education. That means, though, that every school district needs to have the resources to really invest in those kids. I was proud working with Governor Wolf to break through what had been a logjam on what's called a fair funding formula that takes into account things like poverty, takes into account things like the trauma some kids really experience on their way to school, and gives those schools that are dealing with those challenges the resources that they need. You know, another observation I would just share with you is, as a mom of 3 kids who have come through mostly public school, my kids are in 10th grade, and 9th grade. One of my kids sat through 8 weeks of standardized tests. 8 weeks of just sitting in the desk, no stimulation, no creativity. That costs millions of dollars and really takes away from the educational experience. As a mom, I want to back down and back away from so much of that standardized testing. And the last thing I want to comment on, you really hit on this challenge we have in terms of the concentration of poverty. We've made progress in civil rights in many respects, but this concentration of poverty we have to take on, and it starts with education.
John Fetterman.
Zoe, unfortunately in this state and in this country, your zip code often determines your destiny, your socioeconomic destiny. And in my community, that's especially true. Braddock is one of the poorest communities in the entire Commonwealth, and our education system has some serious challenges, but the way we've responded to those is we have what I would call and describe as one of the finest, if not the finest, pre-K program in the United States, if not in the Commonwealth. And what that does for kids is that it closes the achievement gap kids coming from low-income households. And if you don't close that achievement gap from those households, you literally create a tower of inequality in that young person's educational life. The second point I'd like to make out is that there isn't a crisis in public school education in Pennsylvania if you live in the right zip code. In my home county of Allegheny, Mount Lebanon, Fox Chapel, these are the best school districts in the state. But if you live in a zip code like mine, 15104, you go to one of the more challenged school districts. And there's an unfair distribution of resources across these districts. And that's fundamentally unfair, especially because you have so many communities across Pennsylvania that have been decimated and have had their tax base ripped away, much like mine is. We have to fix that funding formula. And finally, in terms of education, one that's overlooked is, through my own direct efforts of instruction or the legacy programs I've established, I've helped nearly 1,000 young people, almost exclusively of color, earn their GED. And the GED is one of the most overlooked economic development tools. It's one of the most overlooked educational tools in this country and in this state, because every person who earns their GED will earn $200,000 over the course of their working life without. And without a GED, you're frozen out of higher education opportunities, community college, barber school, electrician, you name it. So I have a comprehensive experience in dealing with those issues in a community of color with low resources like my own.
I want to follow up real quickly, because when we talk about these funding inequalities in Pennsylvania schools, which, by the way, rank worst in the nation, where we've got Lower Merion per student spending in a year is $23,000 versus Mount Carmel, for example, where it's $8,600. Give us a concrete example, and I'll begin with you, Mr. Sestak. How do you address that unequal distribution of funds for schools?
Yeah, I mean, here in Pennsylvania, you can take my congressional district. I used to visit Upper Darby. 41 different nationalities, 62 different languages are speaking there. And at the time, from property taxes, about $7,000 per student. Go about 4 or 5 miles up the road to Radnor. I mean, it's very nice. And it's about $22,000 or $23,000 in property taxes towards a student. So we have to move away from property taxes. I mean, John's right. You should not be judged upon where you lived as far as funding going towards it. And here's why it's most important to this issue of income inequality. Half the children under the age of 3 years old are children of color. If they don't get, and so many are in these impoverished areas, if they don't get a fair opportunity, because in 15 years they're our largest national asset in terms of numbers, if they're not our largest national asset in terms of quality of education as well as healthcare, we, the United States, don't make it.
And I'm going to stop you there. Give us a concrete example. What would you do, Katie McGinty?
Well, start with you get what you pay for, Patty, and we have to invest money in schools. We still have not made up the gap of the $1 billion that was cut out of public education in the previous administration. What does that mean? It means when I was in a public school in Philadelphia 2 days ago, sat down with a third grader, and she said, my favorite thing to do is to read. I said, that's terrific. She said, but I can't read anymore. I said, why? And she said, because they cut the funding, we don't have a librarian, and there's a lock on the library door. If I could get into that library, I'd read all day. We need to start by putting our money where our values are, and that should be with our kids.
John Fetterman.
Our public education system in this state is inherently unfair simply because you're coming from a community like mine that lost 90% of its population compared to an affluent community like the one that you referenced. And until we address that fundamental shortfall, it's never going to get better. And the only way you can address that shortfall is with resources, whether they come from additional property taxes, whether they come from additional state aid, whether they come from federal aid. The bottom line is like that is the ground zero of where inequality in this nation starts from. These schools that have absolutely no chance from, if you come from the wrong zip code, of really being able to get ahead in life and establish yourself and embed yourself in a middle-class career in life.
All right, we go now to Ethan Paul. He is a sophomore studying economics and political science at Penn State. Ethan?
Thank you. The gap between the annual earnings for the wealthy versus the rest of the middle class has been consistently rising since the 1980s. Many think this income inequality is behind both anemic growth rates and political unrest. Do you agree? And what solutions do you offer that will help to close this gap?
First to Ms. McGinty, please.
Ethan, you really put your finger on it. One of the greatest crises we have in this country is the fact that people are working hard, but they're not getting paid a decent wage for that hard work. I saw a statistic just the other day that said since the supposed end of the Great Recession, 75% of households in this region are actually earning less. We have families now, remember, in the Great Recession, caused by the Wall Street stuff that we saw, the behavior there, led to 5 million Americans losing their homes. Americans lost on average 40% of all their assets. But I think your insight is exactly right. The way we begin to drive that forward is we pay people a decent wage for the hard work that they are doing. I've been on the forefront pushing for this fight for 15 to make sure we're at least starting there and then making sure that that $15 an hour would increase with inflation, number one. Number two, I believe my mom worked at nights in a restaurant. We should get rid of this sub-minimum wage and have everybody starting off with something halfway decent. Equal pay for equal work is vital. And guess what? That would add almost $500 billion of new economic activity if we paid women the same wage for the same work that they are doing. Look, we're the only industrialized country that doesn't provide paid family and medical leave or child care. If we did that, it would increase, by some estimates, our GDP by 9%. Hard-working people are the backbone of our communities and our country, and we need to honor that by paying people a decent wage and enabling everyone effectively to be in the workforce.
Mr. Fetterman.
Ronald Reagan ushered in massive tax cuts for the wealthy, and that began a massive transfer of wealth from the middle class to the top 1%. And that's been going on for the last 30 plus years. If somebody, one of the criticisms is, well, inequality is a one issue kind of candidacy. It's like, if you think inequality is a one issue kind of candidacy, you don't get inequality and how pervasive it is in this country. Why, when the mills closed in my part of the state in the late 70s and early 80s, it was, well, that's capitalism. Good luck with that. I hope you find a new job. But when the financial collapse in 2008, 2009 occurred, it was, how many billions of dollars do you want? How fast can we get it to you? And, oh, you want some $1 million bonuses on top of that to retain your employees? That's fine as well, too. Why do we in this country value tech jobs, over blue-collar jobs? And it's a fundamental bias that we have in this economy. And we in this nation have to realize that until we provide good quality manufacturing jobs. Why aren't iPhones manufactured in the United States? Because of tax policies, because of incentives, because corporations make more money when they manufacture these things overseas. We need to restore manufacturing to this country and to this Commonwealth. And until we do, by getting money out of politics, the 1% is always going to rig the game. And all that started back in the point when you referenced back in the early 1980s.
All right, Mr. Sestak.
Ethan, thanks. And yes, I think it is the primary scourge of why people are, quite frankly, so distrustful of the system today, the establishment. Probably why a lot of them, unfortunately, being attracted to Donald Trump, where they see him railing against the system that they know isn't working for them. And it isn't. Look, today, the majority of American working families are earning $2,000 less in real income and benefits than they did in 1999. And of those working families, a 20% increase have their partner, their spouse, also working. Working harder, not moving. And so I think that is the epitome of it. And it's great that we've seen this income inequality issue raised to a national level in the presidential debate. But it isn't just about distribution of wealth and just about having better benefits. There's that. I mean, since the 1960s, corporate taxes used to be about 30% or so of all federal income. Well, no longer. It's about 9%. As we've watched Apple and others move places overseas, or Pfizer trying to do another inversion so they don't pay any taxes here. We got to stop that, but it's more than that. To fix it permanently, not just take care of the fever, but what causes it, you need economic mobility. That's the course I taught here at Penn State. What you have to do is the question, Patty, you brought up, education. My gosh, students today, you are going to pay over the next 8 decades, anybody who gets a loan from government, $123 billion extra because the government's going to make a profit on you. What? Because it's got the wrong interest rate in it. Number two, small businesses, they create 70% of all jobs. Back in the 70s as well as today, guess what? They still create 70% of all jobs. We're only having half as many created all the time. You go to Philadelphia, where we talked about education earlier, where I was working, they've had a negative small business growth rate. Now, we've got big corporations in there, but there's so much more to do across a myriad of ways, including transportation, the new internet that you can't even use to go to Union County from here.
And we'll leave it there. John Fetterman wanted to add something to that discussion.
Yeah, well, I mean, with all due respect to my colleagues here, it's like the deck is stacked. And anyone here following the Panama Papers, you know, and it's like, you know, it's like this whole shell game, this international shell game where if you know the right people, you make enough money, you know, you get to have your own offshore company and you get to hide your income and you don't have to avoid paying taxes. And, you know, it's just a fundamentally rigged economy. And until we close all those offshore loopholes, until we start, you know, do you realize that the 6 Walmart heirs, the 6 Walmart heirs, part of the Lucky Sperm Club, they own the equivalent of what 42% of America owns. I mean, think about that. 6 people have the same amount of wealth as 42% of the American public. And I don't understand why that's not more of an outrage. I don't understand why we in this country can't realize that the rules and the deck has been stacked since that time that you referenced in your question.
Mr. Sestak?
And Patty, just to finish up my last point, which actually builds on John's, is I meant to say this infrastructure. It's just not roads, but you go throughout the rural counties in Pennsylvania, there's really not a lot of internet in those places. Who's going to stay there, from dairy farmers all the way to youth? But yet 23 legislatures, to John's point, in America have somehow, by the telecom communities that have used influence of theirs, 23 states, including Pennsylvania, are forbidden to have the municipalities build their own internet, like Tuscaloosa has in Tennessee, which is much more quick, much more capability than what Verizon and Comcast can provide. The fix is in many places, and his point's
And I'm going to leave it there. You have a couple of second
Sure.
comment, Ms. McGinty.
Well, look, you know, right now we all know that manufacturing jobs are good jobs. We need to bring them back to the United States. But we have to recognize that service jobs also need decent pay, decent benefits, decent wages. And I've been proud to be out there with janitors, nursing assistants. They break their back. And you know what? I'm going to stand for the right to organize and collectively bargain. Pat Toomey would like to wipe out unions that have had the back of hard-working people. That's got to be part of the equation for people to be able to have strength of numbers, to be able to stand up and negotiate for themselves, manufacturing, and back-breaking service jobs as well.
Let me just say this, Katie. You said that you are for 15 as a minimum wage. We all know that the federal minimum wage hasn't been raised since 2009. It's $7.25. John Fetterman, how do we get to $15? I know you agree, and on this issue, the three of you are like-minded.
Well, I mean, how do we get to $15 an hour? We make it $15 an hour. I mean, I know that sounds simplistic, but this idea, like I was contacted by a union in Erie, and they said, we really want you to kind of shine some light on our situation. And I met a gentleman who is a housekeeper, and he makes $7.75 an hour. And when you take out all his deductions, and they're significant, he comes home every 2 weeks after breaking his back for 80 hours for over 2 weeks, $357.93. Who here among us would like to clean hotel rooms for 80 hours and walk home with $357? You know, why do we in this country pretend that you can live off of $8 or $9 or $10 an hour? And the end of the day, we pay for it as a society because this man and so many others, you know, is on food stamps as a result in public assistance.
You have 30 seconds, Mr. Sestak, if you'd like to add to the conversation.
You know, I voted for that $7.27 when we went to Congress, three-tiered approach. But again, if you look at it, we can go to $10.80 immediately. Why? All studies have shown that if you raise the minimum wage to no more than half the average hourly wage, no jobs are lost. New Jersey did that. Coterminous to the county borders of Pennsylvania, no more jobs are lost. And then index it to inflation, and as wages increase as it gets in that three-stepped approach like we did down in Congress a few years ago, up to that 15-hour wage.
And we'll leave it there. We need to go to our next question, which I think is a great segue to that question about income inequality. This is from Tyler Schwartz. He is a freshman history major at Lafayette College. Go ahead, please, Tyler.
Thank you. Some Democrats want to impose trade tariffs to protect domestic workers. However, these trade barriers could eventually cause domestic job loss, higher prices, and aggravated foreign relations. Do you think the potential long-term costs of imposing these trade barriers are worth taking to protect domestic workers?
We begin with Mr. Fetterman.
Well, let me just tell you, I live across the street from a steel mill, and I never thought I would live. I thought I would leave this earth without actually uttering this phrase. But Ross Perot was right about something, and that was the giant sucking sound from NAFTA, and all the jobs that have been lost. My region has been decimated by free trade and this idea that it's like if you open it up, it's all going to work out great. Trust us. And it's like Lucy pulling the football away every time, and it's the American worker that ends up landing flat on its back. My community lost 90% of its population. The mill that is in our community employs nearly 600 people, and those families depend on that. The Chinese actually hacked that plant to steal some of those secrets. We need those tariffs. U.S. Steel stock price a couple of weeks ago was down below $8 a share. You know, they prove that these companies are dumping their products in our country. And if we don't protect our industries, they're gonna go, like just most of them have already. We have to protect our industries, because if we don't, and that mill in my community, for example, closes, as mayor, I'm gonna wake up one morning and say, okay guys, what do we want today? Police officers or crossing guards? You know, we need to preserve the manufacturing jobs that we have left in this country. Certainly no more, that's more urgent than in my part of the state.
Mr. Sestak.
The answer is, at times, yes, you're right, it's wrong to do. Other times, it's right to remove those trade barriers. For example, some of the trade agreements, and my doctorate was in political economy. And so I look at this issue very seriously. It's why NAFTA was not the right trade agreement, nor do I support TPP when you have 8 of the 11 nations out there with a minimum wage of $3. And as John spoke about, the intellectual wealth that has been stolen from China is not protected in the TPP. It's been called the greatest transfer of wealth by the head of the National Security Agency, as China not just tries to steal defense secrets, but the new technology for solar power panels, as it did recently in Oregon. And those protections weren't there. But if we can get better trade agreements that are fair, we can actually at times lower our prices, but they need to be fair. The other issue is we have to look at this world a bit differently also. It is a globalized world. There's no longer arms races like with the Soviet Union, but there is economic races. And today, if we can get a fair TPP that can bind to us, those nations out there, from Vietnam to Japan to others, that have had 4 naval conflicts already with China, as it's dominated the South China Sea as inland waterways because it wants the $19 trillion a cubic feet of natural gas under it, and has set up an infrastructure bank to try to bind others to it and set the rules of the road unfairly, then we have problems. There's a lot of work that needs to be done also in other areas. Let's just take rare earth minerals. Everyone's cell phone here, who Patty said turn off, every munition that our United States military uses has a rare earth mineral in it. And guess who has the monopoly? China. And when we got upset at Japan, it closed it off for 4 days and its market plummeted. So there's a way that we have to be able not just to say trade barriers, but for us to set these things up fairly.
And we're going to leave it there. Thank you. Ms. McGinty.
Well, thanks. I mean, I think for 30-some years, we've been kind of throwing this Hail Mary pass, that just one more trade deal, and finally we'll get equal treatment and be able to access markets and be able to grow our economy. But what we've seen is this parallel trade agreements, loss of manufacturing, and loss of the middle class in this country. So I think we need to try something different. You know, I've lived and worked overseas, and even on the deals that they say are working, what does it mean? Well, it means that contracts are not honored. It means often that you have to hand over 50-some% of your company to a domestic company and form a partnership. And you know, I was a chemist and very much involved in technology, renewable energy technology. You have to hand over the secrets of your technology as well. So it hasn't really worked well. One of the things that also concerns me is the details of some of these trade deals. Now, these are 600 and 700-page, very complex deals. The TPP that's being debated right now, I oppose. Here's a couple reasons why. One, it doesn't protect our inventions. Like in life sciences, when we're on the cutting edge of hopefully, and let's pray, we're able to cure things like cancer. But that's a big investment and the intellectual property is not protected. What it also does is when we pass environmental laws or labor laws, increasing the minimum wage, it enables other countries to have a say in our laws and maybe undermine our laws. I think we need to invest back in the American worker. I think when it comes to a skilled workforce plus technology like 3D printing and robotics and nanotechnology, nobody should beat America, the American workforce, and I'd prefer to see that we gather the force of Congress to make those investments so that we compete and win.
Let's drill down on this a little bit further. Should NAFTA, and I'll begin with you, Mr. Fetterman, should NAFTA be renegotiated or terminated? And when you talk about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, could it be shaped in a way that it would benefit Americans in terms of jobs and pay?
I don't really see how it could, because you're asking American workers, which are the most skilled and which are the most professional in the world, to compete with people that they're paying 75 cents an hour, and there's no environmental regulations, there's no employee rights, there's no all these things that we have to compete with, and these trade deals rely on the rules of the game that are stilted in the favor of the companies, stilted in the favor of the wealthy people that are behind these agreements. So, fair trade, free trade has never been fair trade. Certainly that's no more true in my part of the state. And until we're able to get money out of politics and really negotiate, until we value manufacturing jobs the way we do high-tech jobs. Nanotechnology is great, but tell that to a guy that's been working at the Edgar Thomson plant for the last 26 years that's worried about losing his job.
Renegotiate NAFTA or eliminate it?
Well, I mean,
Ms.
listen, I think that our priorities need to be really focused on the things that right now, right here, will drive our economy forward and create good jobs here. There's only so much bandwidth Congress has, and right now it's not much bandwidth, and the likes of Pat Toomey, it's all obstructionist bandwidth. Instead of diverting attention to something that hasn't worked in 30 years, as a United States Senator, I would want to be pushing for things like a major investment in infrastructure. The tragedy in Flint, Michigan, kids with lead poisoning. Let's get legislation that marshals resources to rip the old lead pipes out, build modern infrastructure. We just had 2 people killed, another Amtrak derailment. Let's marshal Congress to invest in that infrastructure and make sure that we've got a modern economy that can create good jobs and put people to work building that. That's what I'd focus on.
Mr. Sestak, the Obama administration is for the TPP. What's your stance here, whether we renegotiate NAFTA or eliminate it, and how we go forward with regard to the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
NAFTA, you can't renegotiate it a couple decades ago. You could start a new one if you wanted to, but it's impractical. But TPP, yes, renegotiate. Why? Because it is our moment now to do so. Look at it this way. Manufacturing is about to come home. China, because of its one baby policy, is in a race for time before it's older than Pennsylvania. It is actually going to have about 30 years before it's so old that it doesn't have the prowess, and it knows that. Second, over the last 8 or 9 years, its wages have increased in double digits, 15% every year. I know someone who's already closed 8 factories there and brought 6 to America, 1 to Vietnam. People are beginning to come back. And the issue here for us is to insist upon things that help us, like the Export-Import Bank that Pat Toomey wants to close down. That helps small businesses, not just GE up in Erie, but 92% of all accounts receivable, for example, in the Export-Import Bank, which gives us a fair level playing field for someone who wants to sell overseas, because 62 other nations do this, actually are by small businesses. To the last point also is That gets back to the question, Zoe, you began. Are we ready with the artisans, those who use their hands, the nanofabricators of the future, to be able to get to the community colleges in an effective way to be ready to do that?
Stop you,
and we
Mr.
don't have that
Sestak,
ready.
and give Mr. Fetterman another couple of seconds.
Pennsylvania has a roster of broken communities that is a tribute to bad trade deals. To try to renegotiate them is beyond, the damage is already done. We need a new way of looking at it, and we need to reevaluate, and we need to reprioritize. And putting these forgotten communities in Pennsylvania first is the first step.
All right, and we're going to move on. We have a question now. This one from Jordan Todd. He is a senior majoring in political science and sociology at Penn State. Go ahead, please, Jordan.
Thanks, Patty. Historically, Pennsylvania is a very purple state. Most voters are not at the partisan extremes, but in the middle. What will you do to reach out to these moderate voters?
And what will you do to reach out to these moderate voters, he asks. And we begin with you, Mr. Sestak.
Jordan, great question. You know, after I narrowly lost my Senate race, I went back to all the counties to say thank you, all 67 of my volunteers. You know, I was in Elk County, and we finished saying thanks to the volunteers, and we went to a place to go to eat. You know, in Elk County, you don't find a Starbucks in every corner. It's a wonderful place. So we finally found, well, okay, it was a bar, advertising barbecue. You know, we walk in, everybody has their NRA sticker. We go in there, the jukebox is playing around. I sit down with a wonderful man who's just now graduated from Stanford Law School. And I said, boy, this barbecue's pretty good. He says to me, hey, Congressman, if I wasn't hanging with you, I wouldn't have gone into a place like this. And I backed away and I said, wait a moment. These are my sailors. If my party doesn't understand that we may not get their vote, but to respect where they come from, how can we have the mantle of leadership? I represented a Republican district, 2-1 almost. I was the second congressman since the Civil War. My second race, I won by 20 points and only spent $28,000 in yard signs. We kept the office open 7 days a week. A government of the people worked for the people. 18,000 of my fellow constituents walked in. They walked in. That's larger than 98% of all the cities, boroughs, municipalities in Pennsylvania, because there was a recession and we took care of them. And they had my back. They re-voted to come in. It is a purple state. I did 800 events for others between 2011 and 2014. Two-thirds were in the rural places. We have to understand, I serve with them in the military. They're great. Sometimes you just address issues from where they come from. Like the Affordable Care Act when I'm there. I say, hey, do you know those are the uninsured because they go in the emergency room? That cost gets given to an insurance company and they put it on you. You're paying $2,000 more. If they get covered and pay a little bit, you don't have to pay that. Come from their viewpoint on these issues.
We'll leave it there. Ms. McGinty?
Well, thanks. You know, where I start with on this question is I remember back to my household growing up. 13 people under one roof, 3 bedrooms, and my mother, after cleaning that house all day, would go to work at night as a hostess in a restaurant. Now, trust me, the McGinty household was a no-complaint zone. And that meant that early on, I had to learn how to work it out and figure it out. In my professional life, it's kind of helped, and it's helped a lot. Because when I became Secretary of Environmental Protection, I was bound and determined that Pennsylvania would be a leader in renewable energy and energy efficiency. And the Republican legislature looked at me and said, we're a coal state, that's all we're about, we're not into the windmills thing. You know, but I sat down and I listened. So I said, well, what might move you? How about if I make it about jobs? And I kind of had a bet with some of those legislators. And you know what? I went out and I found the biggest companies in the world, and I persuaded them and attracted them, and okay, I wouldn't let them go till they said yes. But they agreed to locate in Pennsylvania. It was 3,000 new manufacturing jobs. By the end of my tenure, we were one of the leaders in the country in wind jobs, third in the country in solar, and Pennsylvania became the first coal state to pass renewable energy legislation and require renewables. So sometimes it's about listening to somebody else's perspective. But I will tell you this, that compromise is a very good thing. Capitulation is not. And it's equally important to draw the line when valuable principles are involved. And there, I remember taking it on with Newt Gingrich when I was in the White House and he was running the Congress. Remember the contract on America? With America, he called it. He was opposing strengthening safe drinking water protections, even though hundreds of people had gotten sick when we realized we were letting toxins into drinking water. There, he tried to end my budget. He threatened me. I didn't give up, and in 10 months, we had new safe drinking water legislation.
Mr. Fetterman.
I grew up in York, Pennsylvania. Now, most people would not assume or think that York is a hotbed of progressive ideas and liberal populism. Very much not the case. In fact, I'm the only Democrat in my family. And I learned many Thanksgivings ago not to stop taking the bait. So, one of my lame campaign jokes is always, I hope I'm the first Democrat that my family votes for in April. So I grew up around it. I understand it. And at the end of the day, when you're able to sit down and have a civil conversation with people that are moderate or more right-leaning, and I just sit down and ask them, like, okay, would you like to live and work for $7.75 an hour? And invariably they like, well, of course not. You can't do that. I'm like, well, then why not pay them a living wage? Why not pay them something that they can actually live on? Do we argue about the science behind an iPhone? Of course not. It works. But why do we argue about the science about climate change? I mean, there's so many different things in the policy sphere right now that we as a society shouldn't be arguing over, and they're not radical ideas. And at the end of the day, I'm fighting for Pennsylvania's forgotten communities. And in this state, either you live in one of these communities, you used to live in one of these communities, or you still have relatives or your parents living in one of these communities. And I can't tell you how often I'm contacted on social media from people that say, I'm a Republican, and I may not agree with everything that you're saying, but I respect the fight that you're taking on, and I respect what you're doing, and I'm actually going to shift my registration to go Democrat to vote for you. So I like to think that my candidacy can be a bridge between the two parties because of the issues that I'm taking on in my campaign.
Well, speaking of switching candidacies, the reality is that between January 1st and April 3rd, roughly 159,000 Pennsylvanians switched parties. And of those who switched, 50% more switched switched to become Republican who were Democrats. How concerned are you about that? And how do you get, unite this party? And I'll begin with you, Mr. Fetterman, and work my way down.
I actually thought that was a clerical error, and they cleared that up. No, I mean, honestly,
I read the article you're talking about, but the final number, no, this is the correct number, 159,000 Pennsylvanians.
Well, I mean, of course, whenever the red number goes up, that's a source of concern, and as a blue guy, and you probably could assign that to the Donald Trump phenomenon. And to me, what I think the Donald Trump phenomenon is behind is that it's a group of people that felt like they've been left behind, and Donald Trump is their collective finger to the rest of the world. And there's like, you forgot about us, and this is the message that I have for you, this bombastic carnival barking, and they don't really care what the ramifications are. So of course it's a concern to me, but at the end of the day, Pennsylvania always does the right thing, at least it has in the last several elections for president.
Ms. McGinty.
Well, first of all, I don't think we know all of the rhyme and reason behind that switching, and it might well
Some may be strategic.
Some might be strategic just in terms of maybe having an opinion that a Donald Trump or a Ted Cruz should be directed somewhere other than 1600 Pennsylvania. But I do think this is part of a bigger issue that we all need to keep our eyes on, and that is the fight to make sure one person, one vote is really real. One of the things that is very healthy that has happened in this Commonwealth with our new governor is getting rid of the last governor's attempt to keep people from the polls with voter ID, and now have online voter registration. More than 300,000 new voters have registered. The other thing is, this fight's not over. Pat Toomey is trying to make it so that President Obama can't appoint a new Supreme Court justice. Part of that's about voting rights, folks. Did you see the lines in Arizona just in this voting season? People waiting for 4 hours. Look, I'd love to believe that was just a fluke, but I've been around this block, and that's about people trying to keep people from the polls. This whole issue is really important. It's fundamental to our Constitution and our country that we fight for the integrity of one person, one vote.
You look like you wanted to add, and I'll get to you, Mr. Sestak. Okay, Mr. Sestak.
Thank you. This definitely is another representation of what I think is a much larger issue. Look at the United States Senate. In 4 years, it's gone from 60 to 40, 60 Democrats, 40. In 4 years, now it's all the way down to -6. Where are the titans that once roared in that Senate, like a Kennedy? Good senators, but where are they roaring? I watched Rubio Cruz get down there within a month. They had a bully puppet. You can disagree with them, almost equal to the presidency. Tell me across this great state, what official statewide has ever held an open town hall like the old days? I walked across this state, 422 miles, held up my combat boots I'd worn on the ground in Afghanistan when I headed the Navy's anti-terrorism short mission, nothing like the Army, the Army Marines. And I said, I'm going to walk across this state, an event every day, from fair pay for women all the way to seniors and protecting their Social Security, day and day and day after. And a Republican came out as I was walking through one place, Palmar, where I did an event at the Sinkhole Saloon to emphasize infrastructure. And he saw me and he said, Admiral Sestak, I'm a Republican, but I love what you're doing. Those 800 events and being out and about, where are the people doing that?
We're going to leave it there, Mr. Sestak, and go to our next question. This one comes from Alexa Ain. She is a sophomore at Penn State. She's majoring in political science.
Thank you, Patty. Could you describe an experience that taught you how to deliberate effectively with people you disagree with?
And we begin that with Ms. McGinty.
Well, my goodness, Alexa, it's a wonderful question. And I think there are so many examples and issues that go through my mind. But I guess I'll start at least with one. You know, when I came into office working with Governor Wolf, there were a whole lot of really tough challenges that were left behind. And one of them was whether we were going to stand up and do what's right in terms of the Affordable Care Act, where we were going to jump into that to enable Pennsylvanians to have the benefit of health care. I will tell you that the Republican legislature deeply, strongly, not bashfully disagreed. But you know, I knew it was the right thing to do. The governor knew it was the right thing to do. So we did a couple things. And it was about first sitting down and listening. At the end of the day, we decided we could get there if we found a way to show it would save a whole lot of money as well as being the right thing to do. And at the end of the day, we put this together. It was very complex. It was hard to do, but it not only covered now 600,000 Pennsylvanians, but we made it so that it actually saves us $500 million a year. And we had to change some of our approach in terms of getting there. Another example along those lines, in terms of saying, look, let's make sure everybody has the dignity, the opportunity for health care, but getting there with cutting costs. A lot of people, like my mom and dad, I think they would like to have had a better option in terms of home and community-based health care, but expanding things and offering a new benefit the Republicans were not going to go along with. Here's what we learned. If you give people the dignity of that option to stay independent, to stay functioning in their home and community, it's the right thing to do, and it's like only 10% of the cost of institutional care. The easy thing would have been to just do it. We wound up in a better place, I think, because of people's input.
John Fetterman.
Sure. Disagreeing with people. I'm from a smaller town in western Pennsylvania, and I was elected in 2005 by one single vote, the difference. And that's a pretty close election, and I also like to point out that I voted for myself. I'm not the only person in the leadership position in my community. I actually also have a borough council, unfortunately. And that group of people, they weren't fans. It wasn't the John Fetterman fan club when I took office, needless to say. In fact, they actively campaigned against me, and on a very small scale, it was much like the obstructionism that President Obama faced when he took office, in terms of he could come out for lazy Sundays, ice cream and puppies, and they suddenly can't stand all three of them. So that's the kind of headwind that I faced when I took office, and at the end of the day, I tried to work with them, but it was abundantly clear early on that I wouldn't be able to. So we were able to just actually kind of work through them and work around them. And unfortunately, we were able to find a lot of common ground. And I think that's an important lesson is that sometimes you can't find common ground. And through our efforts in community policing and economic development, we went over 5.5 years without a murder in our town, a loss of life, a record unmatched in any community in Western Pennsylvania. We brought new businesses to our community. We've achieved a lot of success, and in subsequent elections, we've been able to replace that original council with new progressive members of council. And the old guard is watching a lot of Wheel of Fortune these days. And again, from my experience, I wish it would have been the other way around and we could have worked together. But when someone is diametrically opposed to you instituting reforms and changes, sometimes you just have to go through them, around them, and create a new system.
Mr. Sestak.
The one that most stands out in my mind is growing up with my 6 sisters, but it was tough. The real one was, however, Alexis, was in Congress. I kept my office, as I mentioned, open 7 days a week, and Republicans come and go, but it wasn't only that. If you disagreed on an issue, let's say choice, I'm pro-choice, and you wrote in and you disagreed with it, and there's some pretty tough letters and emails that came in every quarter. We would go back to them and say, gotta care, come on in at 8 o'clock Saturday morning, I'll sit down and discuss it with you. We didn't just say no, just let's go down and talk about it. Didn't mean I won them over or not, but the next quarter, instead of 50, about 40, and then kept working its way down. Sometimes people just, like sailors on a ship, want to tell the captain what they think if he goes down to the mess decks. But the real one was down there in Congress. I was called the most productive congressman in my class. 20 pieces of bipartisan legislation passed by the House, more than any other, as Steny Hoyer said, majority leader, member of my freshman class, more than any senator or congressman here in Pennsylvania. And we did it by principled compromise, without compromising one's principles. The first movement of money into autism in 12 years, where 1 out of every 45 children born in Center County this year will have autism. When I did it, 1 out of every 115 had it. Bipartisan, the first Elder Abuse Act in 17 years, because we have an increase of elder abuse here every year in Pennsylvania about 35%. But then I took a Republican with me to see our soldiers there in Walter Reed and showed them the new traumatic brain injuries and showing how IEDs go 360 degrees and the horror that they endure, and said, can we give forgiveness of loans for those who go into occupational, physical, and therapy and audiologists and speech pathologists for them? We worked together in order to have that done.
And
There's a way to do it.
We're going to leave it there. We go to Paul Nessler, who is a sophomore studying international politics at Penn State. What's your question?
Thank you. Would you support or sponsor any legislation that limits the donations of wealthy donors and large corporations that have been increasingly dominant since Citizens United?
And 1 minute each for this. We begin with Mr. Fetterman.
Answer to your question in a hell period, yes, period.
Yes.
Citizens United, I think, is the single greatest threat to our democracy. I have a 7-year-old son, and I don't want to have to tell him when he turns 18 that it's going to cost $4 billion a year to run for president. And really, I think that's the track we're on if we don't reverse Citizens United. My campaign, I'm proud to say, is grassroots powered. The average donor of my campaign is about $26, and we raise the overwhelming majority of our donations online, and that flies certainly in the face of certainly some of my opponents up here on the stage. And at the end of the day, that's the only way that I think you should have campaigns, is that you should be beholden to the people and your donors. And these donors, I don't want to spend more time with him because he can give me a check for $2,700 versus him because he can only give me $27. Each vote is important, each perspective is important, and money distorts that.
Mr. Sestak.
Yes, when I got to Congress, I submitted a piece of legislation for public financing of campaigns. Didn't go anywhere, tried to, but of course it might have even been ruled unconstitutional. But I also turned down a $1.2 million lobbying job from natural gas industry. 433 congressmen and senators have taken those lobbying jobs. Many who work in Harrisburg do it. It's a revolving door. It's legal, but you're telling me that that's proper, that's service? Money is insidious out there. I submitted a bill that said when Citizens United passed that, hey, look, at least the corporations should have the shareholders vote upon it. And like John, because as you know, The power brokers in the Democratic Party down in Washington, D.C. are opposed to me. 98% of my contributions, approximately since they shut me down, are less than $200, unheard of in a Senate race. So yeah, money in both parties is quite insidious.
Ms. McGinty.
Yeah, Paul, I think that this is, you put your finger on one of the things that is really drowning our democracy. Our democracy right now is drowning in all of this campaign money, and especially, here's one thing about Citizens United that I don't think gets enough attention, and that is it allows secret money so that there's massive influence around our elections and our campaigns, and it's not known to the public who's making those donations. It's called dark money. I think in a democracy, there's no room for secret checks. There's no room for dark money. We need transparency. We need accountability. To me, it removes all mystery as to why it is that hardworking people haven't gotten a raise in this country in a bunch of decades, as to why it is that we now have CEOs who used to make 30 times the average salary of their employees in the 80s, making 400 times that salary. It comes back to this dark money in politics that needs to go.
We'll wrap with this question. There are lots who are saying there's national interest in this race, and there are some saying that this race, Pennsylvania's 2016 Senate race, could decide which party controls the U.S. Senate under a new president in 2017. What most distinguishes you from your opponents? I'll begin with you, Mr. Fetterman, and why should voters put their faith in your ability to defeat incumbent Republican Pat Toomey in November?
Sure. Well, when it comes to Pat Toomey, I got about 9 inches and 150 pounds on him, for starters. But also, beyond that, you know exactly what you're getting, with me. And the head of the state party believes that I'm the strongest person to go against Pat Toomey. And again, no disrespect to Mr. Sestak, but he lost to Mr. Toomey. And no disrespect to Ms. McGinty, but when she ran for governor in 2014, she got 7% of the vote. I believe that I'm the strongest candidate to run in this race, and I believe that I would be the most clear, distinct choice between myself and Pat Toomey for voters.
Mr. Sestak.
Yes. When I ran the last time, we were outfunded, the largest funding gap of all any governors or senators race except one, 3-1. Without the support of the party establishment, we crawled to within 2, where our gubernatorial candidate lost by almost 10. But the reason is, I want to bring integrity of service back to government and those who serve. I don't want to just win. I want to govern. And how can you govern without the trust of people? I left the Navy because my daughter had brain cancer. I was an independent. I had to pay back my nation because you all saved her, your parents did, with their health care. And so that's why I want to believe I can win, because people, I hoped I can earn their trust.
Ms. McGinty.
Well, Patty, I'd say a couple of things. First, if you're concerned about where we go on the environment, which I think should and needs to be a top priority, that's where I've dedicated my life and my career. But if you also believe that we need to show and break the old myth that it's jobs or the environment, well, I've got a 25-year track record of showing you grow good jobs when you're smart about the environment. Second thing is, I'm proud of my government service, but I think it's important to have other experience as well. And I've started new businesses, and I've invested in entrepreneurs, and I know what that's about.
We're gonna have to wrap it up.
Third is the perspective of a working mom in Washington. We could use that, I think.
All right, and we have reached the end of tonight's debate. We hope you are armed with information that will help you make an informed decision on April 26th. Our thanks to tonight's students for their questions, the McCourtney Institute for Democracy for its vision and partnership, and to the candidates John Fetterman, Katie McGinty, and Joe Sestak for taking time out of their busy campaign schedules to join us and share their positions. And for all of us at WPSU, thanks for watching and good night.